All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome. I want to thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Audrey Bullis, IMF's Programs and Communications Manager. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's discussion that we are very happy to be hosting in collaboration with George Washington University. I'm, of course, happy about that as an alumna and a member of the IMF team. The conversation comes just ahead of Egypt's presidential elections this December, and as its economy remains in crisis. Inflation has hit record highs, unemployment continues to climb, and a worrying number of Egyptians are making the difficult decision to flee the country in hopes of reaching the shores of Europe as refugees. The deal that Egypt struck with the IMF nearly a year ago was a sign of hope for some, but Egypt has failed to make progress on many of the reforms demanded by the IMF, and the program remains in deadlock. So today, I'm proud to introduce the two esteemed participants in our discussion. We're very glad to be joined today by Yazid Saif, a senior fellow at the Malcolm H. Kerr Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut, where he leads the program on civil-military relations in Arab states. His work focuses on the comparative political and economic roles of Arab armed forces, the impact of war on states and societies, the politics of post-conflict reconstruction and security sector transformation in Arab transitions and authoritarian resurgence. Yazid will be speaking this afternoon in conversation with none other than Shana Marshall, the Associate Director of the Institute for Middle East Studies and a research professor at the Elliott School of International Affairs. She is a non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute, a member of the Middle East Research and Information Project, or NARIP, and the Security and Context Project. No matter where you're joining us from, we encourage and invite the audience to submit questions. If you're joining us via the live stream, please submit your questions using Zoom's Q&A function. If you're here with us in person, please save your questions for the last third of the session. We'll begin with Shana and Yazid in discussion for the first part of the session we have here today together, and then we'll turn to your questions in the audience, both online and in person in the latter third. So without further ado, the floor is yours, Shana and Yazid. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Everyone hear me okay? Thanks so much, Audrey, as well as Tim and now Doug at the Tahrir Institute. We really appreciate you collaborating with us, and we hope to have more collaborative events in the future. So as Audrey alluded to, Egypt is in talks with the IMF for a new balance of payments loan of about $5 billion. The major stumbling block to that has been currency management. Basically, the IMF and other external creditors want Egypt to devalue its currency again. It has lost about half the value of against the dollar since early 2022. So that's obviously really exacerbating inflation and making food and other basics very, very difficult for ordinary Egyptians to afford. However, this issue of devaluation and the selling off of state assets, right, or privatization, which is always sort of a large component of IMF stabilization projects, is really fraught with competing pressures. So the potential buyers of Egyptian companies, right, high net worth individuals and foreign financial interests that will own these Egyptian factories, fields, hotels, and service providers after the privatization is complete, want to wait until the pound loses even more value, because then the assets will be much cheaper for them to buy. Egypt obviously wants to prevent any more devaluations before privatization for the exact same reason, right? It will get much less money for the assets that it's selling. But it also needs the foreign currency, the foreign exchange or the hard currency from those sales as a buffer before it lets the currency depreciate, so that it has sufficient reserves in the central bank to pay for critical imports, which will be even more expensive as the pound continues to drop in value. So there's a real sort of catch-22 or a Faustian bargain, or I don't know which metaphor you want to use, but it's not a good one. So the major buyers, mostly the Gulf states and large private equity firms, are playing hardball, hoping to get more assets for their money as the crisis deepens. Many of these investors that initially offered to buy huge chunks of Egyptian firms are now backing out of those initial commitments, leading the Egyptian government to search for domestic buyers. In some cases, these searches have become demands, with the government putting enormous pressure on Egyptian conglomerates and wealthy business owners to essentially step into this investor vacuum. And when they don't, they can be targeted with trumped up charges of undermining national security or supporting terrorist groups, in some cases winding up in prison when they refuse to put up the money to bail out some of these state-owned companies. Against this complex backdrop, it's very important to separate the issue of privatization of civilian state-owned enterprises from the issue of military ownership specifically. State ownership of economic assets is not necessarily bad. There are many contexts in which state-owned enterprises are profitable, including many in Egypt, that were nonetheless privatized in previous rounds of IMF mandated economic restructurings in the 90s and the early 2000s. Many of these restructurings took otherwise well-functioning companies and sold them at below market prices to regime cronies who drained the company's accounts, sold the land and the capital equipment, emptied the pension funds of the employees, and deposited their ill-gotten gains in overseas bank accounts. There is substantial empirical evidence that for a wide range of specialized heavy industry, public infrastructure, and health and education-related services, public ownership can in fact be more efficient and effective than outsourcing to the private sector. However, privatization has been pushed by a range of international actors for ideological reasons, which themselves should not be the basis for economic decision-making. The matter of military ownership of public companies is another issue entirely. This introduces a host of problems that must be separated from the broader question of public ownership. Military companies enjoy a huge range of costly subsidies that drain revenue from the Egyptian state. Their losses are absorbed by the Egyptian treasury, while their revenues are hoarded by the military. They exploit and repress their workers. They intimidate and often destroy rival operators. And they use these sources of leverage to expand their control over not just the economy, but politics and society more broadly. All these are justifications for dismantling military ownership of economic assets, but we should not confuse this with an ideologically driven commitment to privatization at any cost. Like virtually every country in the global south, the major obstacle to ameliorating poverty and economic dysfunction in Egypt is a global economic system that privileges creditors, currency speculators, and other financial actors while burying populations in debt that by design, they can never be repaid. So the push for a broad sell-off of state-owned firms in order to raise short-term revenues for the state is presented as the only option because raising revenue through more borrowing is seen as dangerous. And the state is either too weak or too corrupt to collect taxes from its richest citizens. Egypt's short-term debt, meaning debt that will come due in the next 12 months, is near 90% of its foreign reserves. That means it'll come down to a choice of whether to pay that debt on its due date and risk a shortage of funds for critical imports like medicine, medical equipment, industrial inputs, etc., or to default on that debt. A devaluation would make Egyptian exports cheaper and therefore more competitive, but this would not come close to filling the gap. The only real way to close that gap is to forgive a large chunk of Egypt's multilateral debt and force emerging market investors and other large financial interests to accept the losses that are the flip side to the high rates of return that they have enjoyed for decades as a protected class of investors. It is only fair that those pocketing high returns during boom times are periodically exposed to the genuine risks of unfettered capital markets in order to limit the real suffering that this debt burden will impose on Egypt's estimated 40 or 50 or 60 million people living at or below the poverty line, depending on your source. So it's within this very broad context of dire economic predictions, large-scale centralized corruption, and military dominance that today we're discussing the role of the military in the economy. Yazid, can you give us a sense of how we got here? How has the military expanded its ownership of economics assets since Sisi came to power in 2013? How has its strategy or the pace of expansion changed since then?
Well, thanks, Shanna, for the question, the introduction. Also, I think the context setting is crucial, and thanks to the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy and to the Institute for Middle East Studies here at Georgetown University for hosting me. Sorry, George Washington. What did I say? George something else?
Georgetown.
Georgetown, sorry.
Source file.
George Washington Town.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's where it came from, the mistake. So sorry. So this is like being in Oxford and complimenting Cambridge in England and vice versa, so I've been there. Right. So just to add a little bit of context, today's discussion about the military economy in Egypt, or the military's economic role in Egypt, in addition to the context that Shana just gave, I also want to put in context of a minimum of 3, at least 4 policy initiatives have been rolled out by the Egyptian government since October 2021. So depending on how you count it exactly. And I'm noting that because it gives you a sense of a problem of policy coherence. I'm talking about economic policy initiatives and programs, reform programs signed with the OECD in October 2021, the so-called state ownership policy process, which was launched in May 2022 and finally ratified nearly at the end of the year by the government and then by the president. And then the memorandum of economic and financial policies that the government of Egypt submitted to the IMF at the end of November as part of the new loan program agreement. Then there's the privatization initiative that the Prime Minister launched in February of this year, which both builds on and diverges from previous privatization programs that have been launched over the past 5 years. So, and then there was an economic conference in October last year, presided over by the President and the Prime Minister, which wasn't quite a policy initiative per se, but was meant to be a framing process for all the rest of this. And you have to ask yourself, when a government can issue quite so many policy documents, strategic policy documents within, such a short space of time, whether they all actually, fit together. Why do you need more than one? And whether there's genuine coherence. And in fact, on looking at some of the detail in these programs or initiatives, there are clear areas where there are either direct contradictions or where there are ambiguities that aren't resolved when you go from one document to the next. I'm adding this to the context because when we think about what the military does in the economy, it does this, at the direction of the president. It does this heavily, if not entirely, with funding from the government, or at least whether it's government revenue or government borrowing, or operating with private market actors who bring their own borrowing to bear in projects that are managed by the military. So there's a multiplicity of economic actors involved, or sources of funding. But what shapes us and gives it strategic direction is first and foremost what I think of as a state-led investment strategy that the president has developed and evolved over the last 9 years since he became president. To what extent that reveals a clear economic vision or understanding of the economy is not quite what I'm saying here, but simply that is very heavily committed to state-led investment, and it's within that the military then operates and functions. It brings to the table its own legacy, its own path, dependency, let's say, from activities it undertook under previous presidents, and in particular during Mubarak's era from 1981 to 2011. It brings also its own biases and assumptions about what the economy is. And there's a lot of, sort of overlap between what Sisi understands the economy to be and what the military understand the economy to be. Neither of them are economists, neither of them are financial experts. I think that fundamentally they understand the economy as a mere collection of discrete or individual projects. The more projects you have, the bigger the economy, which does not reflect an organic understanding of the economy as something that involves multiple actors and grows in certain ways, and where incentive structures operate in different ways. It's a very simplistic attitude, which, however, has evolved. And here's where I'll come to Shana's first question, the opening question, that there has been a tremendous shift and an exponential expansion in scale, but also in scope, of what the military does in the economy since the military coup d'etat in July 2013, and since in particular Abdel Fattah al-Sisi came to power in 2014. There are those researchers who've argued in the past that the military already had an economic empire, sort of ever since Abdel Nasser came to office, basically in the mid-50s, and initiated laid the foundations, especially in 1961, with the nationalization of the economy. That Nasser laid the foundations for a fundamentally military-run politics, but also a sort of a military economic empire. And I've disputed this in my own work. And I think that the military went from certain privileges, but a high level of inefficiency and a very modest share of key economic sectors overall until 2011 and until 2013. And I think this is important simply because what has happened since 2013 has been exponential in the massive increase in the share of the military in government-funded public works, construction of housing and infrastructure above all else. Infrastructure here, including in particular road transport, but other means of transport, cities and slum regeneration and so on, housing, as I mentioned, but also discrete cities, so-called desert cities and smart cities, but massive amounts of land reclamation in desert areas, agricultural production, fish farming, increasing involvement in mineral extraction, gold prospecting, to black sands for heavy metals, and so on. So the scale of this has been enormous. By 2018, the military was responsible for about a quarter, based on data given by official military spokespersons and by the cabinet, the government civilian cabinet. The figures they gave showed that the military were managing a quarter of all government-funded public works projects in Egypt. My sense, I haven't done the numbers since then, but my sense is that that share has not dropped. It may have increased once you add in land reclamation and new ports and airports and so on. So we're talking about a very significant part of the economy that's managed by the military. So that's sort of the quantitative expansion. There has been a qualitative expansion as well, in that the military have moved into new sectors. So, for instance, their share of cement production or steel production went from something like 1% up to 2011 for cement and 0 for steel, or nearly 0, to where they've got something like a quarter of total capacity, production capacity in the country in these two sectors. That, of course, correlates with their deep involvement in construction. And they're in this curious situation where they're not a full monopoly in the production of these two materials, but they're sort of monopolistic, and also in the position of being a monopsony, i.e. they not only control the sale or production of something, but also set the price because they're also the main consumer. And that's a very interesting situation. And it's also interesting because in these sectors, these have always been highly protected sectors in Egypt. Private actors in the past benefited from government protection, and that worked for private sector and public sector civilian companies in cement and steel. Once the military became part of this, that relationship changed, and civilian participants lost out, and a number of companies have had to, suspend or reduce production. A few, including public companies, have gone out of business because the military has entered these protected sectors in ways that ultimately meant that the military could take all the advantages of trade protection, partly because the military benefits from things like no customs duties on its imports, favorable foreign exchange rates, access to commercial bank and credit, and so on. Other factors of production, their transport trucks don't pay tolls on highways, which they run. So in fact, the protection now started to work against the private sector participants in these sectors. And so it's a very curious outcome. But then there have been other ways, and I'm saying, spending a bit of time here, and hopefully that'll mean less time spent later in my responses. But what's also been very interesting is the way in which the military are seizing market share in sectors where they're not really competitive. So the military, until a few years ago, there were about 36 or so military companies, officially registered military companies belonging to 3 main entities or 3 or 4 main entities in the country. This number is at least double that now. So there's been an expansion there, and that reflects they're getting into new sectors, hothouse agricultural production, black sands extraction, phosphates, various areas like that. But what's also interesting here is that, firstly, that their share in manufacturing, in industrial manufacturing, صناعات التحويلية in Arabic, is actually not so major in terms of overall military income or of overall production in the country. Manufacturing is actually an area where they're not really competitive. And yet they've expanded year on year. The Ministry of Military Production, which owns about 20 or so of these companies, has posted claims of massive increases in overall turnover and in profit. We're talking up to 30% year on year increases. These are amazing. Partly is because so much of their production capacity was underutilized. And so they managed to increase that. But that's not because of better production or better marketing. It's because the minister of, well, they've had about 3 or 4 since in the time I've been looking at this, basically went around other government ministries and persuaded them, given the military's political influence, so, leveraged that position to get them to transfer their contracts for procurement of supplies and goods from civilian providers in the public and the private sectors, to hand these contracts over to the military. So what the military did was to poach public contracts, public procurement contracts. So the overall pie, the economic pie of Egypt wasn't expanding. All that was happening was that the military were taking someone else's share and then posting, of course, impressive growth and looking good to the president. So there's that angle. There's as I said earlier, moving into new sectors. One of those is the information revolution area, digital technology. There's a big push there. And here there's a qualitative shift where officers, generals now, sit in on key committees, the Industrial Development Authority, I forget the name, the 4IR, sort of Digital Technology Revolution Committee, Information Revolution, I think it's 4th generation, whatever. So they sit in on, they've moved from being people who poach contracts or get contracts from government to where they now sit in on policy setting committees or committees that try and design strategic plans in key areas of growth for the economy. And just so I can wrap up here, there's much more to say here, but I'll throw out a final idea that one of the trends, and this is maybe what we'll come to next, is that a growing number of military agencies have become economically active. There's this, in other words, everyone wants in on the act. A lot of this is driven, as we'll be discussing, I know, in a moment, by looking for revenue, not just for the military, but for the state itself, for the state treasury. This is what the president is desperate to do. The military, in a way, ride on the coattails of that. And so we now have this odd situation where, say, the Air Force, which is a newcomer relatively to delivering government-funded projects compared to, say, the armed ground forces, which in the past were more prominent. The Air Force now manages a 2 million land reclamation project known as Mustaqbal Masr, Egypt Future, west of the Nile Delta in desert land. Whether this is effective or not in any of its stated objectives, we can discuss later. But this is now being run by the Air Force, which delivers half of the overall reclamation itself and manages private contractors delivering the other half. This is quite an extraordinary situation. The Navy now also has its own industrialization admiral, which presumably is the first step towards the Navy also being given its opportunities to set up its own projects. Why don't I leave more for your next
Yeah,
questions?
so I have sort of two. You can choose, I guess, which one you want to answer because one of them's new. So one question would be, does the military have different strategic reasons for controlling different sectors? Like in some sectors, the central concern may be using that industry to extract revenues or to buttress support from the officer corps, while in other sectors, it might be the provision of cheap food or infant formula or something, so that it can be about presenting the military as a sort of a guarantor of cheap necessities for the Egyptian population. So that's one question. Or, I know there's a lot of competition between the branches and then between the different conglomerates, right? To enter into the same industries sometimes. I remember you mentioned hothouse agriculture. I remember there was a time when different military agencies were building their own hothouse agriculture with investment from different European states. And they were sort of going to be competing for the same market, and they were each was trying to get the leg up on the other. So it was sort of like a factional sort of almost contest between the two. Is which of those, either if you'd be interested in expanding?
Both, because I they sort of tied together quite nicely. Well, picking up on your very last point, what has emerged in the 9 years since Sisi took the presidency is a growing military economy or growing military intervention or involvement in the economy, which has created something of, it's an overheating situation, bit of a gold rush. And so everyone wants in on the act. And we've seen clear signs of that kind of, well, there's profiteering, but also competition, duplication of effort. But I want to set this again in context, as I did at the start. The first thing to look at, I think, is that Sisi sets direction in critical ways, which both give the military justification and opportunity. And then as you filter down sort of the lower ranks, the incentives and the motivations start to diversify, right? So you get different things going on at different levels. At the top level, at the level of the president, he is clearly has been nonstop determined to increase state revenue. And his understanding is rather simple. The more people do things that we know or think are profitable, generally speaking, the better. The fact that that might generate non-productive duplication doesn't sort of come to him. And his generals, therefore, and individual managers of factories and companies in the military domain all go out and they all identify the same things that look profit-making. So they all go for them. And of course, that is likely to be ineffective. Or when they do get involved in these activities, they're doing so at the expense of other civilian actors that were providing the same things before. Whether better quality or not, we can debate. But the net effect is to deprive civilian actors in the public and private sectors of market opportunities without necessarily actually increasing overall revenue for the state. Given that the military keep all their income, their net income from all these activities, this is something means that a lot of the revenue doesn't actually go back to the state treasury anyway. Plus also that when the military is involved, there's lost revenue because they don't pay customs duties on imports and taxes, income tax, property tax, etc. So the net value for the public purse is very debatable. But of course, we don't get the exact data and numbers to be able to say conclusively what sort of net gain or net loss there is. What we have is a lot of rhetoric about the military being better managers, less corrupt, they deliver on time, but we never have the kind of data to assess that when they deliver something in record time, because the president often wants things done faster than even the military think it can be done, that pushes up the cost of delivering. We have no way of assessing what the actual cost is against also its genuine economic return in terms of net income for the state treasury, net benefit for the economy, and whether the investment, the return on investment is actually, positive or negative. So we lack that kind of data, and until that data is accessible in the public domain, of course, I think that the military have to basically prove their point, but we can't simply take it as read that. Okay, so that's one aspect of this. But the striving for cash, for income, is overwhelming. And I think it's driving very problematic consequences. The duplication of effort, in a way, is almost a minor. I mean, the fact that you might have, right now, you've got the National Service Projects Organization, which is a sort of conscript army of the military, which comes under the Ministry of Defense, does land reclamation, as does the Engineering Authority of the Armed Forces, as does the Ministry of Military Production, and there's at least one other agency I've forgotten besides the Air Force. So there's several people who do these things. Now, you could argue, and they could argue, that, well, there's so much to be done that no one military agency or civilian agency can do it all anyway. We all need to take part in this. That's possible. So the issue is less about the duplication of effort, and it's more that we have no way of really assessing cost benefits, of cost effectiveness and return on investment in any of these situations. Now, in terms of the motivation and the incentives, so the other thing that CC does is when, so he wants things done in 1 year instead of 3, like with the Suez Canal expansion, which ended up costing double the amount that it would have otherwise cost. But also he goes around saying, okay, so we need animal breeding complexes, right? But when they launched, I think it was 3 of them a few years ago, rather than start with 1 and test pilot and make sure it worked out, he said, no, I want 3. With the result that 1 of them closed completely, 2 of them don't do animal breeding because they, they were failures. The same with, for instance, the cement production. They built an enormous plant in Beni Suef with Chinese help, $1.2 billion investment. And it's said, according to, well, at least one inside source, that the military wanted to set up 2 production lines. And he said, no, let's go for 6. And so now they've got massive underutilized capacity. So there's constant stories of this kind. Fish farming, which is being rolled out on a massive scale. What I've been told is that the concept there was that the military, thanks to its advantages of cheap labor and not paying extra taxes and customs and so on, would produce these fish farms at 80% of cost compared to civilian competitors, and would then sell on to the market at, say, 120% of cost, and make a 40%, and split the difference, I guess, hopefully with the state treasury. And what happened was actually that, for all sorts of reasons, including that they're not as great as they think, and there's probably corruption and siphoning off of resources, that they ended up producing these fish farms at above market cost and are unable to sell them on without making a big loss. And that's without looking at the environmental costs of a lot of these projects, which maybe we should come to a little bit later. I think that these dimensions, i.e. what the president wants, and the military, I think, are trying to achieve what the president wants without understanding what's sensible and not sensible about this direction. But then, of course, there is the fact that different military agencies basically want their share to their opportunity to get into all this. And then at a lower level, you get insider trading, which may translate into one of the biggest things that the military do is real estate, construction of housing, i.e. turning desert land into prime real estate, right? And what they've done, the military have done, since the military owns officially half of the holding company that is now constructing the new administrative capital. we're talking about something that in first phase has already cost an estimated $45 billion that Egypt clearly doesn't have. And half of this whole project is owned by the Ministry of Defense. I'm not saying they have half of $45 billion, but just the holding company. Here in this instance, we know that they've deliberately withheld the release of state-owned land to private and public civilian investors in other areas for their projects, whether it's setting up factories or housing or whatever, in order to push up prices artificially and then sell on real estate at artificially inflated prices. Of course, the income may go directly to the company or the Ministry of Defense and not to private pockets. But in all of this, obviously, the military are insiders, and military officer networks will tell each other, there's a road going through here or a new city being built there, and buy land now at £5 a meter or £5,000 a meter, because in a year's time it's going to be worth 50,000 or 500,000 or whatever a meter. That has been happening for 30, 40 years in Egypt. But you can imagine that with the premium focus now on investing in real estate and using it as the primary engine for generating, above all else, revenue, which is Sisi's primary obsession in my view, he's creating opportunities for many civilian but also military actors to come in and profiteer. And there's again more to this that I could add.
I'll maybe ask maybe one or two more questions. I don't know if there's any questions in the chat, but you mentioned foreign investment, the Chinese investment in the cement factory. And it was surprising immediately after the coup, there was actually an increase in foreign investment right into Egypt, and a lot of it was from Europeans, which would ordinarily, or you would think would be talking about, we're not going to contribute to the growth of a state where a military coup just occurred. But in fact, it was the opposite. And it looked like, to me, it was because they could be sure that the military was in control of the economy, right? So they knew where their money was going. And they knew also that the Egyptian government was probably going to be a very large customer for their arms industries and for arms exports, especially the French, right? Because Egypt was, I think, the #1 buyer from the French and the Germans of arms exports for several years in the past, 5 or 7 years. And so they were also investing in a lot of military companies that had nothing to do with arms or defense production. So are you surprised by that? Is there still that much European investment in these military-owned firms? Because it seems to me like the Chinese would be like, you can't have 6 production lines if you only need 2. This doesn't make any sense. We're pulling our money out, because that's what they did with the administrative capital, right? So.
Yeah, I mean, so I know you've worked a lot on this particular aspect, and I haven't done the kind of detailed homework you've done on that. But to go back to a point I made earlier, first of all, my sense is that when it comes to the officially registered military companies, their value is fairly modest. Their real value. And were it not for the powerful political position of the Egyptian military, they wouldn't have any return on investment. The only return they have is artificially contrived, because they can take contracts. So for instance, the military bought Stella de Mare or whatever, major hotel. Well, there's a couple. There's this very prestigious one on stilts somewhere in the sea. But there's the big one, I forget where now, in Sharm somewhere. Is it? Yeah. There's a major, huge one that they acquired from a private owner at an unknown price, which is assumed to be below real value. And what I've heard and seen in reporting is that they've been unable to fill it to a sort of basic level of capacity. And what they did was they went to various ministries and said, your employees, you've got sort of various vacation deals with different resorts and different hotels, et cetera, package deals and special discounts, bring them all to us. So, and also the military have been doing this for years. They make sure that conferences like the recent narrative of a homeland conference. These kinds of big conferences are held in military-owned facilities as a way of getting money to them. Now, in this particular case, I forget the name of the hotel. Even with all this, they've barely been able to reach something like 20% occupancy. So but this is an example of the kind of leverage they use to bring in some income, but in ways that ultimately is still not, a good return on investment. So when we talk about foreigners, whether, individual investors like any of us here in this room or companies investing, I think that most of these companies are not actually attractive investment destinations. It might be attractive to put money in a company that the military may also have money in, but not in a military company per se. That would be my sense. Where there's real interest, I think, and real investment opportunities, and where there is investment, is in projects and schemes managed by the military or where the military is a partner, but not in military companies. So the military have been emphasizing, with a lot of the good economic logic, emphasizing the Suez Canal zone and the Red Sea coast around Ain Sokhna as major investment destinations to create industrial zones, shipping services zones, all of which makes very good sense from a commercial and economic point of view. What the military is mainly trying to do, of course, is make sure that this is its own economic enclave, and all this happens under its aegis, and therefore they're somehow involved. And one way they're involved is that because almost all these areas, if not all of them, literally, are so-called strategic zones, and therefore automatically the military gets to determine who can acquire land in these areas, and not acquire in perpetuity, but lease land according to the relevant legislation. So all Egyptian coasts and borders are strategic zones. All land running along all the main national intercity highways now are strategic zones. And automatically, by definition, that gives an economic commercial franchise to the military in all these zones. And therefore, when massive investment happens by any private actor, foreign or Egyptian, or public actor, in, say, Ain Sokhna, the ownership of these enterprises, massive, chemical and phosphates and other complexes that are being set up. Again, I'm not disputing the economic sense of this, but simply saying that the military at least have a hand because they have to approve land use. And whether they then seek equity, a share of capital in return for a permission to use the land, which happens in some instances, or they just take an upfront payment, it varies from case to case. Whether they're partners officially or subcontractors and so on, all this will vary. In that kind of context, you've got Chinese capital, Russian capital, Italian capital, and so on. So Beni Suef, I think, was a straight-out military-owned company, factory, full stop. And the Chinese, I don't know if they put up the money, but I know how much we're told it's cost. There was a big Reuters article on this. So this is one of the rare cases where the military might have put up their own money, or for at least part of the funding. And I know some of their acquisitions, for instance, of steel companies was apparently their own money. But in most other cases, they're using government money or government borrowing, or getting real estate developers, private ones like in the new administrative capital, to raise their own loans from Egyptian banks rather than the military putting the money forward. So it's private sector, the military tell the real estate developers, we want you to buy land here. We're going to inflate the price by withholding land elsewhere. And then you start building or pay us to build. But the money for this, we're not going to put the money up for this. You go to the banks. And so now I'm told, again, this is maybe speculation, that Egyptian banks hold enormous amounts of whatever the liens on land, on real estate in Egypt, which if all goes well and this great pyramid scheme works and there's customers, then money will keep coming in and the banks can get their money back. But if that process stops, then the banks are going to be left holding a lot of worthless real estate. And it's one of those schemes where it works as long as it works, and then once it doesn't, it falls apart, right? I've lost the thread a little bit, so why
Well,
don't I go back to you?
I mean, I know that the Emirates, right, was in talks to buy one of the large banks, right? And then it
All right.
sort of when the currency devalued, all of a sudden, all the bank's assets were worth, 2/3 of what they had been worth when the Emirates Bank was interested in buying it. And so, of course, this is also causing things
But
to.
you did also, of
yeah.
course, mention that the Chinese had pulled out in the administrative capital, as had the Emiratis, and they did that previously in the 1 million housing unit
Housing,
project as
yeah.
well. And again and again and again, this is because because the military have demanded a share of return or a price for giving land use permission that these partners have balked at. So, what China did with the Beni Suef cement factory had, I think, different calculations and probably didn't actually cost the Chinese what the Egyptians wanted for the capital.
Right.
So it'll vary across sectors. And I think that it's the real estate schemes and some of the major and more economically viable manufacturing sectors like the ones we see in Ain Sukhna and the infrastructure schemes such as along the Suez Canal zone. I think this is where there's more foreign interest. But I'll throw something in here, which is that for all foreign investors, the moment they go into business with the military, where the military is any kind of partner, regardless of what it's putting forward as its share of capital, if only just doing the bureaucratic paperwork, which is often all that military companies do, including the manufacturing companies, when they go in co-production with Chinese or Italian or Russian or Hungarian manufacturers to increase local content and value added and technology transfer, all the wonderful things that the president wants. And so they all claim to be doing. In most of the cases, when you look at the contract details, the Egyptian military company is doing the paperwork and getting licenses and permits done, pushing it through the Egyptian bureaucratic system. And they're not actually doing much value added in terms of local content. But the point I was about to make is that the foreign investors, if the military is involved, then there is no legal protection for their investment because the military are not bound by civilian law at all. Even if military officers are found to have, taken bribes or embezzled, it is up to the Ministry of Defense to determine whether those officers should go to a civilian court for trial or within a military court. And the military penal code has not been updated or revised to cover military economic and business activities in the civilian domain. So people go into business with them, into partnership, are entirely at their mercy. And when it comes to the Chinese or the Italians or others, everything is based on an assumption that they've got good political relations with the presidency and with the military and that will protect them. And it probably does. Although there are other companies, and some of even these companies have found that it'll take years to get some of their permits. There are companies that have pulled out of Egypt because they're not willing to operate in that kind of environment where enforceability of contract is not protected.
Which generates a sort of built-in support for the continuation of Sisi's presidency.
You could say, yes.
To secure the safety of your previous investments. Yeah.
Correct.
Does anyone have a question? I have lots of questions left, but if folks have something, anybody in person have any questions?
Can I ask a question about what the private sector looks like now in Egypt? You talked about both there being opportunities for profiteering, but also that any civilians that enter into agreement with the military are at their mercy. What does the private sector look like? We've also heard about arrests of some high-profile business figures. So has the private sector been kind of scared into complacency or finding where they can be profitable, or is there some pushback from the private sector? And then how different does it look than the way it did under the Mubarak regime?
I guess we need to repeat for the online audience.
No, there's microphones
that's very
everywhere, so
clever.
it should.
Right, I wish we had those at our offices. Very interesting question. A lot of what I'm going to say here, at least the starting point, I owe to is Hat Diwan, who's an actual economist. I'm not. And using World Bank figures, which I think are a little bit old now, out of date, but my senses are still very true, which is that Egypt's private sector, while believed to account for 70% of GDP and job generation and so on, in terms of its structure, the figure I'm citing from is Hat Diwan, is that out of 2 million non-farm enterprises in Egypt, 20,000 were considered as medium and large. That's a 1% figure. And if you think of that, that's 1% up here, and then 99% of all the other enterprises are small or micro or nano.
Informal.
Or in, well, these I think are presumably registered
Oh.
as, I mean, I don't know how how they calculated exactly. And it could be informal, maybe not, I'm not too sure, but.
Restaurant kiosks.
Yeah, oh yeah, restaurant kiosks and so on. So we're talking about a private sector structure, if you imagine it on a sort of infographic, which starts up with a little, tip up at the top of Empire State Building, and then drops right down to street level, and 99% are down there. Now, that doesn't look like the private sector of any other country I can think of, where there's much more of a sort of, is it a trapezoid or a rhombus or something, or a cutoff pyramid, right? Where you've got, maybe a small, but nonetheless significant number of large companies, a hefty chunk of medium-sized companies, and then a number of small companies. And there's a certain proportionality between them. This tells you about the incentive structure in Egypt for private sector growth, which is, bottom line, that most private sector participants lack the opportunity to grow and expand beyond a certain size, because at a certain point, growth will involve interventions, demands for payment, for share of equity, for bribes, for whatever, from various powers that be, civilian and not just military or security, in licensing, in giving leasing for land use, in approving import certificates, in approving nowadays, especially access to foreign currency. The list is quite long. Unlike, say, Turkey, or unlike Chile, or unlike Pakistan even, I mean, I find the comparison with Pakistan, which used to be made fairly often between Egypt and Pakistan, is actually very relevant today, precisely because despite endless military intervention in politics in Pakistan, one thing the military seem to understand in Pakistan is that they actually need and want an active and fairly dynamic private sector to generate capital, for innovation, for whatever. That is not the understanding in Egypt. But let me add one flip side to this, which is, let's not fall for the assumption that if only the private sector were somehow liberated in Egypt, all would be good. Partly because the private sector is in a very extensive dependency relationship on the state, which is not only imposed by the state, but where I keep going back to this essay by Robert Vitalis, looking at the rise of Talat Harb and early Egyptian capitalists during the monarchy, and then the early days of the Republic. And he basically makes the argument that big capital in Egypt wanted state investment and wanted state leadership because that was a way to get easy access to contracts and money. So, let's not fall for the idea that somehow, you take the state out and the private sector will do everything that's wonderful. Quite the contrary. I think that, big business in Egypt, there's been this very curious shifting relationship between power under Mubarak and then under Sisi, where initially after 2013, the military and Sisi were very suspicious of big business. They didn't immediately rehabilitate Mubarak cronies to the contrary, they kept them at arm's length, but neither did they replace them with their own cronies. But also there's been a shift in the last 2 or 3 years where the military became so large, their portfolio that they're managing in the economy is so large, that instead of managing it themselves and awarding all the smaller contracts, say housing, they're building, say, 100,000 housing units. The system was, until a few years ago, they go to different medium and small private actors, private companies, and dole out contracts. So this guy gets to build a building. That's, guy 10 buildings, this, and so on. And that Muhammad Ali, the guy who, the fugitive who went to Spain in 2019, was a medium-sized investor who for a long time benefited from this system, got a lot of these contracts, and then ended up with huge arrears. The army weren't paying up, and so he went public. But the military have moved on from that model. Now what they do is they go to big businesses and give them the management. And they just sit back and go even more strategic. And so it's interesting, Orascom always gets part of the contracts. Arab contractors, whether that's public or private, I still can't work out. What's it? Allam and Hassan Allam and 2 or 3 of the others. They always get a chunk of almost every major project. But what's interesting is where they're also awarded the management that the military used to do. And now they're happy to pass it on to someone else. And that means also that their social alliances are shifting, because for a few years, giving contracts to small and medium companies, like in the the Suez Canal expansion, the so-called second Suez Canal, they were directly giving, there were about 112 smaller contracts. A lot of them were to companies not only had we never heard of, but I tried to actually research these companies, find out where they were registered. Did they have a website? A lot of them had no visible presence. And they might have been bona fide, but they were often no more than someone with a couple of bulldozers who was given a contract. And so, of course, there'd be maybe someone knew someone. But even more important than that, there was a sort of, I think, an ethos that the military were trying to cultivate a sector of small and medium businesses as a different social clientele than big business, which they were suspicious of because of its potential political ambition. Now that that's sort of more or less settled down, they've gone back, I think, to allowing a lot of market share to big business without, of course, any political influence, though, at the same time. Now, whether big business, if given the chance in shaping policy, whether they differ fundamentally, I don't know, because, say, when it comes to labor rights, organizing, things like that, I suspect they would be no different than the military on these kinds of issues.
Other questions?
So the title of this program, I guess, is Impasse with IMF.
Mm-hmm.
What's the outcome? I mean,
Okay.
I cycle through every 3 or 4 months. I meet with everybody I can, bankers, lawyers, accountants. Back in February, everybody said, yes, something will give. Nobody knew what it would be, and it would happen in about 6 weeks. Well, that's now been 8 months, and
Right.
nothing has happened yet. That was last there in June, and still very difficult. IMF's put off its reviews. Supposedly they were going to pick it back up, I think, in November. I don't know the status of that, but what's the end game?
Well, I'm glad you took us back to the title of the panel. And it's fascinating in so many ways. I mean, for one, that the IMF, it started signaling, I think, in July 21, sort of a new tone, because that was the first time the IMF put military companies on the radar officially. That wasn't a priority and still isn't. And I think we should be aware that the military companies angle is a minor one here in the broader scheme of things. And also as I think, well, in sort of correspondence before today's talk, Shana and I and Timothy Kaldas and a couple of others, we're reminding each other that the military are both sort of state-owned companies, but there is so much more than simply, yet more state-owned companies. They're very special, and I think the IMF at least are aware of the distinction there. So the framework for structural reform is one that is presented as applicable to all state-owned entities, including companies and economic authorities, etc. Now, were that to be implemented in full with application to the military companies, then I think that would be quite a big step forward. Partly because among the most important requirements are things like financial transparency, publishing biannually, i.e. every 6 months. I hope I've used biannual correctly. Yes, I always wonder. Their full financial reports, and that this should be auditable and so on. So these are crucial aspects without which we can't assess almost anything in the Egyptian economy generally, but also in the military economy. Now, and may I, I want to remind everyone here and online that this obligation is something that the Egyptian government signed on to with its Memorandum of Economic and Financial Policies of 30 November. It's an astonishing document in many ways. I mean, I wondered almost if the IMF had written it for the Egyptian government, but I'm told reliably that no, the Egyptians did this. Maybe they brought in foreign consultants, I don't know, because the tone and texture and style and grammar, everything in it is quite different than the state ownership document that was developed in 2022. I mean, different people wrote these two documents, which doesn't mean the Egyptians could have done it. But the Memorandum of 30 November is an amazing document, which, if implemented in full, would be revolutionary in its transformation of the Egyptian economy, or the political economy, not just the economy in the sort of narrow sense. Now, and part of the commitments made there repeatedly in that document by the Egyptian government, which now forms a part of the loan agreement with the IMF, is to bring all state-owned companies, including military companies, this is said time and again, into exactly the same frameworks and commitments and obligations and requirements. That in itself is quite extraordinary. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to happen. We all know that. And I think the IMF also, if they saw progress on other fronts, would not necessarily say, oh, but you haven't done the military yet. I mean, that would get kicked down the road. And fair enough. Devaluation of the Egyptian pound clearly is what the IMF sees as the first step, without which nothing else happens. And it is quite significant politically that the IMF have made this such a core demand and then stood by it quite so insistently for so long. Now, where Egypt is today, however, I mean, you mentioned, things that were promised in 6 weeks and then 8 months later, and you're talking about the program as a whole. So first and foremost, I think we need to go back, and this is a point that Timothy Kaldas made in more than one article, great pieces, that there was, there's a crucial moment in 2016 with the first major IMF program, right, the $12 billion one, and the devaluation of the Egyptian pound. And there was this moment when the Egyptian authorities could have really done something with that and started to make some significant changes. I'm not a free marketeer. I'm like Shana, I'm skeptical that, privatization, et cetera, is necessarily a panacea, magic key. Nonetheless, there was an opportunity for the Egyptian government to do a whole lot more. That opportunity was lost. Instead, what the government did and the presidency did was to say, great, we can now get cheap money. And they borrowed much, much more than before. So everything I described earlier about 2014 to 2016, in terms of the expansion of the military role, all of that went through the roof after 2016. I mean, it was already expanding from 2013, September 2013, when the government awarded the first major contracts to the military for road development and so on. We're talking about nearly $1 billion immediately. And then the Suez Canal expansion, which was put under military management, a $4 billion budget that became an $8 billion budget. And then the launch of the new administrative capital scheme in 2015 and Sharm el-Sheikh in the March 2015 Sharm el-Sheikh Summit, Economic Conference. But it was 2016 that changed everything. Now, what I mean is there's a certain path dependency, or maybe rather it's not necessarily dependency so much as decisions. I mean, Egypt came to a crossroads in 2016. It took the wrong turn. And Egypt is now paying the price. So now the Egyptian government is scrambling to find dollars. And it, already with the pandemic, it came under pressure. Even before the Ukraine war started, it was, still wedded to the new administrative capital project, to new cities, to land reclamation in the manner that they've been building. There was no attempt to rethink any of this. The military scope and share was expanding. Yes, the assigning the Nile Delta, the new Nile Delta project, land reclamation, to the Air Force happened last year, after the Ukraine war had started, and of course after the pandemic, right? So decisions were still being made in the same wrong direction, committing Egypt to massive new borrowing and long-term consequences. Because, the more you've invested in things, right now, the Egyptian authorities are stuck in this horrible situation where do they throw more money after, more good money after bad, in the hope that somehow these schemes will finally deliver? Or do they say, no, we stop now? But then what about all the money that's already been sunk in these schemes, which could have been sunk in other things? So it's an own goal that has been, recurring time and again. So we're looking at things now towards the end of 2023, at things that were in a way decided in 2016, 2017, 2018, and 2022. And now that the government is trying to privatize state-owned companies, and again, whether that's actually a great scheme or not. And by the way, on this one point, the IMF strike me as not desperate for privatization. I mean, it's very interesting. They're not pushing for the privatization. This is the Egyptian government's response, which is we need dollars desperately. And so they're selling off, in some cases, what could be crown jewels, family jewels, like some of the more profitable banks. Now, that hasn't happened because they're disagreeing about the price, basically. But
to sell
it's think about this. The Egyptian government is trying to sell things off, which it depends on for revenue, just because they need the money right now. But that means that their revenue stream is shrinking. And in the meantime, they're stuck neither selling off, but also with a shrinking revenue stream because, of course, of other economic externalities and so on. And they're undermining their own credibility. I think that people who were initially excited might have jumped at the chance to buy various assets are now rethinking. And here's where maybe we come back to the military, because I know this is one of the questions that Shana proposed, and so I'll jump into it a little bit, is the sale of shares in military-owned companies. And primarily we're talking about the Wataniya gas station chain and the Safi mineral water bottling company, which to my mind is a minor player.
They're both pre-CC, really, right?
These existed
Yeah.
from the 1990s. They've been there a long time. Sisi, the whole story is actually quite interesting, and I'll come to it in a second. But so the various Gulf, including Emirati entities, sovereign wealth funds and holding companies, the various investment arms of the Emirates and others, ADNOC and others, have been wanting to buy Wataniya. They initially got very interested. And then they got very cold feet. And there are different stories and accounts why. One was that the books of these companies were in such a horrible mess, or that there were basically no books, no real inventory. The salary sort of scales weren't transparent. Procurement and supply in different gas stations run by different officers in different sectors had their own little deals with different suppliers. I mean, how do you do a valuation of a company in order to offer shares with such a mess, right? So that was one story, and I think it was probably true. That evolved. By the way, this is a company that has been in the hands of the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Egypt since February 2020, supposedly preparing this company for an IPO. Here we are 3.5 years later, and there's still a mess. That's one. Two, there's credible evidence that the military started stripping the Wataniya chain of assets and transferring them to their other chain, Chill Out, right? Before selling. So who in their right minds was going to buy this kind of chain? And what we saw was the Emirates. I forget which company it was. went and bought 50% of Total Energy in Egypt instead, because they knew what they were buying. Now the Egyptians, there's constant leaks saying, there's 7 companies, and Saudi and Egyptian and Emirati and so on, all trying to buy Wataniya. Well, the latest we heard, and this has been confirmed in public, although I haven't got any detail, I don't think anyone has, that the Sovereign Fund of Egypt, I think it was last March, restructured Wataniya and split it into 2 companies. And the rumor is, because the detail, as I said, is not public, is that one company holds all the assets in the Greater Cairo area, and the other holds the assets in the provinces and the other cities. And it looks like that the Emiratis or others are being offered what in effect is the lesser company, so the military hold on to the Greater Cairo company. And again, it's like, who do you think these are? I mean, are treating them like idiots. So all of this is to say that the government, A, has not sold a single share in a military company, has barely sold shares in any of the other companies. Interestingly, the biggest deal so far, which was 2 months ago or so, was an $800 million deal with the Emiratis to buy shares in 5 state-owned companies, civilian companies. And the deal involves the Egyptians paying back 8%. I think it's an 8% or 6% interest rate for the next 5 years, a guaranteed profit return or something. So in other words, they're given $800 million in purchase price, right? I think it was 800 million. And in return for paying back a guaranteed return, it comes out at $320 million over 5 years is what I remember. Paying back to the purchaser in guaranteed profits. Probably A, because they couldn't agree on whether to make the purchase in Egyptian pounds, where the Emiratis would have said, well, they wanted Egyptian pounds because that's lower. And everyone expects a devaluation, and the Egyptian government wants dollars desperately. And so maybe they came up with a compromise where the Emiratis would pay dollars, but in return get, this assured profit, where the Egyptian government doesn't have $320 million to pay back in the first place, but also where what they've done in effect is borrow more money. But money that doesn't have to be put under the heading of debt in national accounts, and therefore doesn't violate IMF requirements for not increasing sovereign debt. So this is the game we're in right now. If we get a few minutes, I'll come back to the military company flotation stuff and share. But anyway, I want to give a chance to anyone else. Any other questions there?
Okay, so I think we only have time for this one last question from our online audience, and that is, I've seen some comparisons between the current Gaza war and the Gulf War in terms of the potential for Egypt to make a political concession to get bailed out of its economic predicament. Could you speak to how valid this analogy is in terms of the economic situation of Egypt, demands that the US would make, and the potential for domestic blowback?
Great question. Okay. And I'm going to use that to come back to the military flotation in clever ways. So yes, there's talk that Egypt could, in return for letting Palestinian refugees, displaced persons from Gaza into Sinai, be rewarded with a write-off of some of its debt. I think that what we're hearing,
Which would be exactly like what happened.
which would be exactly like what happened in 1990, 91, absolutely for sure. Well, 1990 specifically. But that's where the comparison ends and the analogy falls or fails. Firstly, the Egyptians, starting from the president and onwards, have made it super clear this is not, entry of Palestinians in large numbers to Sinai is not on the cards. They've made it super clear, and I think this is totally genuine, and I don't think they're going to be bought out on that. Debt write-off or no debt write-off. That's my sense. And, I think Sisi made a wonderful rebuttal when his first responses were, hell no. But then he said, if you're so concerned for humanitarian reasons to offer a safe haven, put them in the Negev in Israel. I mean, there's a longer border between Israel and Gaza, put them there. And I'd like to hear any meaningful response to that from the US administration or the Europeans, right? I think this is a total non-starter with respect to Egypt. But even if there were to be a debt write-off, the structure of Egyptian debt today is very different. And the structure even of external debt today is very different. We're talking about $400 billion of debt, 2/3 of which is domestic for a start. So we're talking external debt, of course. 50 odd billion back in 1990, which probably translates into 160, whatever it is today, equivalent, I don't know. But the thing is that only, 35 billion, maybe 50 billion today. I mean, at most a third, but I think less than a third of today's external debt in Egypt is multilateral, to multilateral institutions or governments. In other words, most of it is actually commercial, private, and can't be written off unless these foreign governments are willing to pay their banks, which makes it a government write-off, right? So we're already talking about part of this overall external debt, unless the IMF and the World Bank and the German government and the Chinese and the Japanese, but also, most importantly, the Gulf monarchies, which account for probably the largest single slice of all this borrowing and debt, including Egypt's foreign reserves. Most, if not quite all, but most of Egyptian foreign exchange reserves today, and for a few years, consist of borrowing. It's borrowed money. These are not true reserves in that sense. And much of it is Gulf lending. So you'd have to get all the Gulf monarchies on board, along with the IMF and World Bank and Japan and China and, you know, France, Germany, Italy, whoever, all these others, to write off pretty much all their debt. And my sense, well, that would be immensely important. But when you think of just how much Egypt has to repay by the end of this year, and then next year, I forget, what was the latest number we were exchanging on the
24
emails?
billion.
24 billion. I think over 18 months, it's actually even higher than that, right?
Yeah.
So the total debt write-off would see them through, say, 18 months or something. And then what? In theory, it would be enough time to turn the economy around, but only if, you know, the whole real estate scheme approach changes, commitment to the new administrative capital changes, all the big mega projects approach changes,
Interest rates go down.
and interest rates go down, which they're not doing. And there's a lot of magic needed here. So I don't see that even with a debt write-off, there's a fundamental shift. Now, I want to bring in let this be my concluding remarks. What is really interesting here, in response to that great question from your online audience, is to take it in a slightly different direction and project forwards, right? So this outlook is grim, and it's not going to get better. I want to throw in very, very briefly that every single thing the military are involved in has major environmental dimensions that we're not even thinking about or talking about. The construction, which is energy intensive, which is water intensive in a country that's approaching absolute scarcity, as you defined by the UN. The land reclamation, which is using Nile water taken away from the Nile Delta, wastewater treatment, which is great stuff, but of course the actual quality of the water is not great. And underground aquifers are being used for these wonderfully verdant green circles. If you've ever seen the satellite images of the military land reclamation projects in the desert, we don't know the real cost in terms of water resources, and whether what this is a desperate dash for cash quickly against future water scarcity because these water resources are being diminished at a time when rising temperatures are hitting Egypt and North Africa at higher than global averages. It's a tragedy for North Africa that they experience higher temperatures than the rest of the world at peak moments. So the effect on increased evaporation of water from the Aswan Dam, along the Nile, and et cetera, is greater. What's it called? It's transevaporation or something from plants. They lose more water, so they need more water. Roots need more water. Their degradation in higher temperature accelerates. The military projects rely on fertilizer produced in some cases by companies they may have an interest in, but there's an enormously heavy reliance on inputs that in 5 years will degrade the soil to non-usability and will increase salinity. I mean, we know this from a zillion experiences around the world. So the desperate rush, the race for cash today is going to come at a cost within a few years to Egypt that is not just to be measured in less water for everyone, but the cost of mitigating that and of adapting to climate change and of compensating for these things in terms of looking for, so, you get reduced labor productivity as a result of climate change, reduced harvests. Already Egyptian mango farmers and olive farmers and so on are experiencing reductions, significant reductions. And this therefore affects, the balance of trade and therefore balance of payments and basic income, household income. These are real now. So if Egypt is struggling to find dollars today, it's going to struggle even more tomorrow. Now, to come back to where I started on this trend, which is all this is going to become more and more apparent with every year. And so if I were in Sisi's shoes, I'd look for a nice place to retire right now, because his next 6 years are going to be horrific. He's going to be firefighting on every possible front with no good options. And this should be his last term, according to the revised constitution of 2019. The military are going to start wanting to pick his successor. The economic slowdown is already impacting imports. Imports are crucial for construction, which is what the military do a lot of. The dollars just aren't there. Sooner or later, the military will feel the pinch. Maybe everyone else will be made to suffer from not having enough dollars so that the military can still do what they want. But, we're getting to the point where even the military can't get the dollars they need. That is going to have political impacts on the military's attitude to the president, their relationship with the president. And in the context of thinking about the next president, in the context of all sorts of things, I can see this as, one presidential term that I wouldn't want to have. Now, the last point there is the military companies. Where this is really evident, I think, these dynamics, is that Sisi first went public in talking about offering shares in military companies in 2018. And he later said that this has been under discussion since 2016. He said it. Now, I don't know what that meant, what's true or not. So according to Sisi, this has been on the radar for 7 years, right? He's been public on this since 2018, time and time again. Just under a year ago, after the umpteenth time that the government had announced the imminent offer of shares in Wataniya and Safi, the nth time, he met, I think this was December, with a bunch of generals to discuss the share offer. I wondered why he made a point of having it, in the papers and the media, that he was talking about this with the generals, right? And then in February, Madbouli said, the prime minister said that we're going to offer, and Wataniya and Safi are part of this. And there's 8 or 10 more companies that are going to be added to the list. We still don't know. And none of this has happened so far. What I'm saying briefly is that Sisi has staked not a huge amount of political capital or reputation on this, but he's been talking about this. Usually when Sisi declares he wants something like a new Suez Canal or an expansion, it happens. And the military say, yes, sir. He's not been able to get them to sell shares in 2 measly little companies. That's how I read it politically. They don't want to, for all sorts of reasons. And he has not had the clout to make them do it. And here we are, we're approaching the election, yet another delay in the share offering in Wataniya, all these shenanigans with Wataniya, stripping assets, splitting into 2.
And going to a domestic Egyptian
At a time,
to try to get them to buy something.
and oh, well, yes. And so one of the funniest parts is that the military owned, so Wataniya is owned by Gehaz al-Mashru'at, the National Service Projects Organization, conscript army, part of the Ministry of Defense. So they're selling Wataniya. very recently, a few months ago, they bought 20% of a private company called Taqa Arabiya. Taqa. And now Taqa Arabiya is trying to buy Wataniya. So, now that's if you think that's amusing or interesting, that's not the whole story. Taqa doesn't have the money. It's got, I think, a capitalization of 300 million, I forget, dollars or Egyptian pounds or something, not very impressive. They're trying to raise, according to the press media, 2 billion Egyptian pounds, I guess. Maybe it's dollars. I'm sorry, I don't, it's all out there in the media, from banks, from commercial banks, to buy Wataniya. I don't know if it's worth that much, but Taqa, which doesn't have the money, is trying to get the money, to borrow the money to buy this company, half of which is not for sale anyway. And partly what's happening is the military are now becoming, a market actor in the conventional sense that any other company. I watch Suits, on Netflix. And I'm fascinated by how they're all endlessly sort of coercing each other into selling and buying and, coercing deals. And I think that this is what's sort of going on here. And the military have gone from being, managers of government projects and the sort of boring stuff, and they're playing these kinds of market games from, of course, a position of great power and influence. But to go back to the point, Sisi desperately needs political results, political stability. He needs to, poverty is increasing, as you said at the very start. There's definite unhappiness with him in Egypt. The private sector is investing less in the economy today as a share of GDP than it did under Abdel Nasser and post-socialist decrees of 1961. I mean, I owe Ishat Diwan again for that particular bit of information, right? The private sector's share of investment today is less than it was under the so-called socialist system of Abdel Nasser, after the nationalization of the economy, almost the whole economy in 1961. So Sisi needs dollars. He's trying to get the military to help and take part in this, and the military are not playing ball. So this tells us a little bit about the politics that are coming in the next, few years.
Thank you very much. This was very exciting to me. I hope it was exciting to everyone else.
Must be
Thanks,
worrying
everyone.
when we're excited about this kind of.
I know. Yeah. It's like, what a life I must lead. Thanks so much, everyone, for coming. Thanks to our audience and for your excellent questions. And we'll see you next time.
Thanks so much to all of you. Yeah.